I'm Brenda, 34, female. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood with my husband, Mark, in a house filled with books and the quiet hum of our life together. By profession, I'm an archivist, a job that suits my methodical nature. I find comfort in order, in records that tell a story, and in the preservation of truth. My life was built on the foundations of logic, love, and carefully managed expectations, a structure I thought was strong enough to withstand anything. But I was wrong. A structure is only as strong as its weakest point, and my weak point was my relationship with my mother-in-law, Margaret, a woman who weaponized secrets under the guise of family unity. This is the story of how she took my most profound pain and turned it into a piece of public gossip, and how I used my skills to present an undeniable record of her cruelty, not for revenge, but for an ending. An ending to her influence, her power, and her place in our lives. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The unspoken rule in our family, the one that hung in the air at every gathering, was that we did not talk about the baby we lost. It wasn't a secret, not in the true sense of the word. Mark and I had told his parents, Margaret and Arthur, and his sister, Jessica, a week after it happened. We had to. The grief was a physical weight, a shroud that made normal conversation impossible. We needed them to understand the silence, the distance, the reason we were us anymore. Mark, ever the protector, had handled the call. I sat beside him on the sofa, clutching his hand, listening to his voice crack as he explained that the pregnancy, the one we had been so cautiously optimistic about, was over at 12 weeks. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, filled with the awkward fumbling of people who didn't know what to say. Margaret's eventual response was a clipped, "Well, these things happen for a reason. You're young, you'll try again." Arthur murmured something about his condolences, and Jessica, bless her heart, had just cried softly, her empathy a small, welcome balm. That conversation set the tone for everything that followed. For Margaret, our loss was an inconvenience, a messy emotional detour from the neat, predictable road she envisioned for her son's life. For me, it was a trauma that reshaped the landscape of my soul. The weeks and months that followed were a blur of hollowed-out days and sleepless nights. I'm an archivist. My job is to make sense of the past, to organize it into coherent narratives. But my own past had become a chaotic archive of pain that I couldn't file away. Every baby announcement on social media, every pregnant woman I saw at the grocery store, was a fresh wound. Mark was my anchor. He held me when I fell apart, listened when I needed to talk, and sat with me in silence when I didn't. He understood that my grief wasn't a problem to be solved, but a burden to be carried, and he helped me carry it. He was the one who established the unspoken rule. After that first, brutal phone call, he sent his mother a follow-up text. I didn't see it at the time. He told me about it later, his jaw tight with an anger I rarely saw in him. He told her in no uncertain terms that the topic was closed. It was not to be discussed, not with us, and certainly not with anyone else. It was our private pain, our story to tell if and when we were ever ready. He told me she had simply replied, "Okay," and he had taken that as an agreement. For 3 years, it seemed she had honored it. In those 3 years, we slowly began to rebuild. The raw, gaping wound of our loss began to scar over. It was still there, a tender spot that ached when pressed, but it was no longer constantly bleeding. We found a new rhythm, a new version of us. We traveled, we poured ourselves into our careers, Mark as a software developer, me in the quiet sanctuary of the city archives. We hosted dinners, we celebrated holidays, and we navigated the delicate dance of family gatherings. At every Sunday lunch and Christmas dinner, the topic of grandchildren would invariably come up, usually from a well-meaning but clueless aunt or cousin. Margaret would always steer the conversation away with a practiced ease that, at the time, I mistook for respect. "Oh, let the kids enjoy their freedom," she'd say with a wave of her hand, or "They're busy with their careers, there's plenty of time for all that." I was grateful for her interventions, blind to the fact that she wasn't protecting me. She was curating the family narrative, keeping the story neat and tidy according to her own standards. My miscarriage was a messy, inconvenient fact that didn't fit into the glossy brochure of her perfect family. The fragile peace we had built was predicated on this silence. I needed it to feel safe. The thought of having to explain my pain, to see the pity or discomfort in someone's eyes, was unbearable. It made the trauma feel fresh again, pulling me back to that cold, sterile doctor's office where my world had crumbled. Mark understood this implicitly. He was a fortress around my heart, deflecting intrusive questions and shutting down any conversation that veered too close to the forbidden territory. His family, for the most part, seemed to get the message. Arthur was a man of few words, a pharmacist who dealt in facts and formulas, not messy emotions. He was content to let things lie. Jessica, who was now a marketing coordinator and planning her own future, was sensitive and kind. She never pushed, never pried. She gave me a hug that always lasted a second longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement that she remembered and she cared. And so, life went on. We lived with the unspoken rule, and I began to believe that our privacy, our pain, was truly ours to manage. I let my guard down, trusting that the silence was a shield. I had forgotten that for a woman like Margaret, a retired HR manager who had spent her life managing and manipulating people, silence was not a shield. It was a space she was waiting to fill with her own voice. The peace was not peace at all. It was just a long, quiet inhale before a devastating storm. The rule was never about protecting me. It was about Margaret waiting for the perfect moment to break it for maximum effect. The perfect moment, for Margaret, arrived on a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon in her meticulously manicured backyard. The event was a baby shower for Jessica. It was an explosion of pastel pinks and whites, with balloons tethered to every available surface and a dessert table that looked like it had been lifted from a magazine. Jessica was glowing, her hands resting on her small, neat baby bump, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated joy. I was genuinely happy for her. The initial pang of jealousy and grief that used to accompany such events had softened over the years into a dull, manageable ache. I could look at a pregnant woman now and feel happiness for her without it shattering me. I had brought a thoughtful gift, a collection of classic children's books I had sourced through the archives, each a first edition. I felt calm, stable, even a little bit joyful. Mark was by my side, his hand resting on the small of my back, a quiet, constant source of support. We mingled, we ate tiny cucumber sandwiches, and we played a silly game involving guessing the circumference of Jessica's belly with a roll of toilet paper. It was all so terribly normal. The main event, as Margaret called it, was the opening of the gifts. We all gathered in a circle on the patio, Jessica seated in a large wicker chair that Margaret had decorated to look like a throne. The gifts were piled high, a mountain of adorable onesies, tiny shoes, and brightly colored plastic toys. Jessica opened each one with gasps of delight, holding them up for everyone to see. Mark and I sat slightly on the periphery, content to watch. As Jessica opened our gift, her eyes widened. "Brenda, Mark, these are incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she traced the cover of a vintage copy of Goodnight Moon. "Thank you, this is the most thoughtful gift." I smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "We're so excited for you, Jess." In that moment, everything felt right. The family was happy, celebrating a new life, and my own quiet history of loss felt like a distant echo, not a roaring wave. That was when Margaret decided to strike. She stood up, clinking a glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. A hush fell over the 20 or so guests, a mix of family and Jessica's friends. "I just want to say a few words," Margaret began, her voice radiating a practiced warmth that always set my teeth on edge. She was a retired HR manager, and she still carried the air of someone about to deliver a carefully worded corporate announcement. Seeing my sweet Jessica so happy and ready to start her own family is the greatest joy a mother can know. She paused, beaming at Jessica, who blushed and smiled back. "It feels like just yesterday Mark was this little, and now look at us, waiting for the first grandchild." She then turned her gaze, slowly and deliberately, until it landed directly on me. The smile on her face didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted. It was a glint of something sharp, something calculating. "Of course," she continued, her voice dropping into a more somber, confidential tone, "it's also a bittersweet day. It reminds us of the grandchildren we almost had." The air crackled. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mark's hand, which had been resting on my back, tensed into a claw. I could see the confusion on the faces of Jessica's friends, the dawning horror on the faces of the few family members who knew. Not many of you know this, Margaret went on, now positioning herself as the keeper of a sad, important family secret, but Brenda and Mark went through a terrible ordeal a few years ago. Brenda had a miscarriage. She said the word miscarriage as if it were a delicate, tragic jewel she was placing on display for everyone to admire. The word hung in the air, grotesque and out of place amidst the pastel balloons and tiny baby socks. My breath caught in my throat. The patio, the smiling faces, the cheerful decorations, it all began to warp and blur as if I were looking at it through water. Margaret wasn't finished. It was so difficult for them, for all of us. And I just think it's so brave of Brenda to be here today, celebrating with us when it must be so painful for her. We should all give her a hand for her strength. And then she started to clap. A slow, deliberate, theatrical clap. A few other people, caught in the horrifying awkwardness of the moment, joined in with a smattering of hesitant applause. It was the most surreal, most violating moment of my life. I was being applauded for my trauma. My deepest, most private pain had been turned into the centerpiece of my sister-in-law's baby shower. It was a performance, and I was the unwilling star. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, some filled with pity, some with morbid curiosity, some with sheer confusion. I felt naked, dissected, my scars laid bare for public consumption without my consent. The unspoken rule hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered with a sledgehammer, and the shards were all pointing at me. I looked at Mark. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes locked on his mother with an intensity that could have set fire to stone. But I couldn't stay. I stood up on legs that felt like they were made of glass, muttered a choked "excuse me," and fled. I ran through the house, past the happy family photos on the walls, and didn't stop until I was locked in the guest bathroom, my body shaking with sobs that felt like they were being torn from my very soul. The fragile peace was gone. All that was left was the cruelty. The ride home was silent. Not a peaceful silence, but a thick, roaring quiet filled with everything we weren't saying. Mark drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw so tight I was afraid he might crack a tooth. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing suburban landscape, but I wasn't seeing any of it. I was replaying the moment over and over in my head. Margaret's saccharine smile, the sound of her voice saying my name, the word miscarriage echoing in the sunny backyard, the grotesque smattering of applause. Each replay was like a fresh stab wound. The grief I had worked so hard to integrate into my life, to carry without it breaking me, had been ripped open. I felt as raw and hollowed out as I had in the days immediately following the loss. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart had been demolished, and all the pain I had so painstakingly archived was now scattered and chaotic. When we finally pulled into our driveway, Mark turned off the car, but neither of us moved. He just sat there, breathing slowly and deliberately, as if trying to keep a volcano from erupting. Finally, he spoke, his voice dangerously low. "I am going to kill her." It wasn't an expression of anger, it was a statement of intent, spoken with such cold conviction that it sent a shiver down my spine. "Not literally," he added, seeming to read my mind. "But I'm done, Brenda. I am completely and utterly done." I finally turned to look at him. His face was pale, his eyes shimmering with a mixture of rage and unshed tears of his own. He was hurting, too. It was our loss, our shared pain, and his mother had just treated it like a piece of juicy gossip to liven up a party. "How could she?" I whispered, the words barely audible. Why would she do that to me, to us?" "Because she's a narcissist," Mark said, the words sharp and bitter. "Because your pain made her the center of attention. She got to be the wise, empathetic matriarch sharing a tragic family story. She got sympathy. She got to look brave by talking about a difficult topic. It was never about you, Bren. With her, it's never about anyone but herself." His analysis was so clinical, so accurate, that it cut through a layer of my emotional turmoil and hit the cold, hard truth. He was right. It was a power play. It was Margaret reasserting her control over the family narrative, reminding everyone that she was the keeper of secrets, the one who decided what was shared and when. We went inside, the silence of our own home a stark contrast to the performative drama we had just escaped. I collapsed onto the sofa, feeling utterly drained as if I'd run a marathon. Mark disappeared into his office. I heard him pacing, muttering under his breath. A few minutes later, he came back out, holding his phone. His expression was grim, but there was a new, harder edge to it. "I knew it," he said, sitting down. Beside me, I knew I couldn't trust her. That's why I sent it. "Sent what?" I asked, my voice still hoarse from crying. He didn't answer. Instead, he scrolled through his phone for a moment before turning the screen towards me. It was a screenshot of a text message thread. The date stamp at the top was from 3 years ago, a week after our loss. The thread was between him and Mom. His text was long, a block of gray against the white screen. It read, "Mom, about what we discussed. I need to be crystal clear. What happened with the baby is between Brenda and me. It is not a topic for family discussion. It is not something you can bring up to check in. And you are absolutely, under no circumstances, to mention it to anyone else in the extended family or any of your friends. This is our private grief, and this is the one and only time I will say this. Please respect our privacy. This is not negotiable." I stared at the words, my breath catching in my chest. I knew he had told her not to talk about it, but I had never seen the actual message. I had never realized how explicit, how forceful he had been. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a direct order. Below his message was her reply, a single word in a blue bubble. "Okay." The simplicity of it, the stark contrast to the emotional weight of his message, was jarring. She had read it. She had understood it. She had agreed to it. And then, today, she had acted as if this exchange had never happened. She knew, I breathed, a new kind of cold fury beginning to replace the hot tears of grief. She knew exactly what she was doing. "Yes," Mark said, his voice like flint. She knew, she just didn't care. Or more likely, she forgot about this text because in her mind, her emotional whims are more important than any boundary we set. It was then that the archivist in me began to stir, overriding the grieving woman on the couch. An archivist's job is to preserve records, to use primary sources to establish a factual narrative. And right there, on Mark's phone, was a primary source. A digital ghost. It was undeniable proof of malice. Her act wasn't a thoughtless slip of the tongue, a social blunder made out of misguided sympathy. It was a conscious, deliberate violation of a direct, acknowledged boundary. It was a choice. My pain wasn't just a consequence of her actions, it was the objective. The knowledge settled in my bones, not with a crash, but with a quiet, chilling certainty. The sobs subsided, replaced by a strange, icy calm. The trauma was still there, a throbbing wound in my chest, but now something else was there too. Resolve. Margaret had made my pain public. She had created a new record of events in front of 20 witnesses, but she didn't know that I had a record of my own. A clear, dated, undeniable piece of evidence that proved her act wasn't one of accidental cruelty, but of calculated betrayal. In the days following the baby shower, a cold, quiet purpose settled over me. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage, but also a strange clarity. My grief was still present, a constant, low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer the all-consuming force. Instead, my mind, the mind of an archivist, had taken over. When faced with a chaotic collection of documents, my first instinct is to assess, to sort, to create order. I began to view what Margaret had done not just as a personal betrayal, but as an event to be documented and understood. Her action was the crime. The text message was Exhibit A, but a single piece of evidence, however damning, is often not enough to paint a complete picture. I needed to corroborate the crime, to understand its full impact and context. My investigation began not with anger, but with a methodical calm that even surprised me. I needed to know who knew what and when. I needed to understand the fallout. My first call was to Jessica. She had called and texted me a dozen times since that Saturday, each message a string of frantic apologies. I finally found the strength to call her back on Tuesday evening. "Brenda, I am so sorry," she said, the words tumbling out before I could even say hello. I had no idea she was going to do that. I was horrified. It was supposed to be a happy day, and she made it monstrous. "Are you okay?" "I'm not okay, Jess, but I will be," I said, my voice steady. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. After I left, what happened? What did she say? Jessica sighed, a heavy, weary sound. It was awful. As soon as you and Mark left, Dad lit into her. Arthur was furious. He told her she had no right, that it was a disgusting thing to do. They got into a huge fight right there in front of everyone. Most of my friends were so confused, they just packed up their gifts and left. The whole party just disintegrated. This was valuable information. Arthur, the quiet, logical pharmacist, had been my defender. His reaction provided a crucial piece of corroborating testimony. He had recognized the malice in Margaret's actions immediately. "And what was your mom's defense?" I asked, my pen hovering over a notepad. I was taking notes, creating a record. "She played the victim, of course," Jessica said, her voice dripping with a lifetime of frustration. "She started crying, saying she was only trying to honor your struggle, that she thought people should know how strong you are. She said she couldn't believe we were all turning on her when her intentions were so pure. She claimed she forgot that Mark had told her not to mention it, that it was all so long ago. She twisted it to make it seem like we were the cruel ones for not appreciating her tribute to you." Forgot. That was the key word. It was the defense she was building. A lapse in memory, a well-intentioned mistake. It was plausible enough to give her deniability, to allow people on the fence to give her the benefit of the doubt. But I had Exhibit A, the digital ghost that proved she had received and acknowledged a direct, explicit instruction. Her claim of forgetting was a lie, and I could prove it. I thanked Jessica for her honesty and told her that this was not her fault, that my issue was with her mother and her mother alone. We ended the call on a sad but supportive note. She was an ally. My next step was to talk to Mark about his father. Mark confirmed what Jessica had said. Arthur had called him later that night, livid. "I've never heard him so angry at her," Mark told me, sitting at our kitchen table. He said he told her that she had finally crossed a line from which there was no coming back. He's sleeping in the guest room. This was significant. The foundation of Margaret's power was her seemingly perfect marriage and her role as the family matriarch. A crack in that foundation was a serious blow to her authority. Arthur's reaction wasn't just about this one incident. It was likely the culmination of years of witnessing her subtle manipulations and power plays. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The final piece of my investigation was the most difficult. I needed to understand Margaret's motive more deeply. Mark's assessment that she was a narcissist seeking attention was certainly true, but I felt there was another layer. My work as an archivist has taught me that history is rarely simple. It's a complex tapestry of motivations, biases, and unspoken desires. I started thinking back over the last 3 years, re-examining every interaction, every comment, every seemingly innocent question from Margaret. I combed through the archives of my own memory. I remembered the slight, almost imperceptible way she would sigh when a friend of hers announced a new grandchild. I remembered the innocent questions about our future plans, always phrased in a way that implied our childless life was somehow incomplete. "Aren't you worried about being older parents?" she'd asked once. "You don't want to wait too long, the clock is ticking." I had dismissed these as the typical nagging of a mother-in-law. But now, in the harsh light of her betrayal, I saw them for what they were, prods. She was testing the boundaries, trying to find a way back into a conversation Mark had explicitly forbidden. She saw our grief not as a wound to be respected, but as a locked door she needed to pick. Why? Because Jessica's pregnancy had shifted the family spotlight. The impending arrival of the first grandchild was a source of immense social currency for Margaret. It was a story she could tell her friends, a status she could finally claim. My miscarriage, my infertility, my childlessness, it was an inconvenient subplot that complicated her grand narrative. By revealing my trauma at the shower, she wasn't just seeking attention, she was tidying up the story. She was explaining away my emptiness to her audience, framing it as a tragedy that highlighted her own daughter's triumph. She was, in the most twisted way imaginable, clearing the stage for the story she wanted to tell, the story of her as a grandmother. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was an act of narrative violence. She was trying to erase my story and replace it with her own. With that final, chilling realization, my investigation was complete. I had the motive, the method, the evidence, and the corroborating testimony from witnesses. I had everything I needed. The archivist had done her job. Now, it was time for Brenda to decide what to do with the findings. The question was no longer what had happened, but what would happen next. The plan began to form not as a fiery plot for revenge, but as a cold, logical conclusion. As an archivist, my ultimate goal is always the preservation of the truth. An uncorrected lie in the historical record can fester, distorting everything that comes after it. Margaret had created a false record. She had presented a narrative to the world in which she was a well-intentioned, empathetic mother-in-law. And I was a tragic figure whose pain was a tool for her own emotional aggrandizement. Her defense, as reported by Jessica, was that she forgot. This was the lie that needed to be corrected. My purpose was not to scream or to cause a dramatic scene for the sake of it. My purpose was to present the truth in an undeniable, irrefutable format in front of the only people who mattered, her husband and her children. The court of public opinion was irrelevant. This was a family matter, and the verdict had to be delivered within the family. I didn't want to humiliate her in front of strangers. I wanted to dismantle her authority with her inner circle. I wanted Arthur, Mark, and Jessica to see the unvarnished proof of her manipulation, leaving no room for excuses or twisted justifications. I spent a week meticulously preparing. The first step was creating the primary document. I had Mark send me the original screenshot of his text exchange with his mother. I opened it on my computer, verifying the date and time stamps. I then did something that felt both clinical and deeply personal. I typed out a full, word-for-word transcript of the text messages on a separate document. Below the transcript, I wrote a simple, factual heading: Communication Record, M. Miller and M. Miller, October 14, 2022. Topic: Privacy regarding pregnancy loss. Beneath that, I wrote a brief, objective summary of the events of the baby shower, almost like an incident report. On August 30, 2025, at a family event with approximately 20 guests present, Margaret Miller publicly disclosed the private medical information detailed above, in direct violation of the acknowledged directive. I printed 4 copies of this document, one for Margaret, one for Arthur, one for Jessica, and one for Mark. I then took the screenshot and printed it in high resolution on glossy photo paper. It was clear, crisp, and undeniable. I placed each printout of the text transcript and the corresponding photo of the screenshot into a simple, professional-looking manila folder. The archivist in me was satisfied. The evidence was organized, preserved, and ready for presentation. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a curated exhibition of the truth. The next step was orchestrating the venue. It had to be a neutral, controlled environment. Our house was out. I wouldn't let her poison our sanctuary again. Her house was unthinkable. A restaurant was too public. It had to be a place that felt like an official family space, a place where important conversations were meant to happen. This led me to a rather surprising choice. I would ask for a family dinner. One of Margaret's sacred Sunday dinners. It was the perfect stage. It was her domain, the place where she held court. To confront her, there would be to challenge her on her own turf, to dismantle her authority in the very seat of her power. Mark was fully on board. When I explained the plan to him, showing him the folders, a slow, grim smile spread across his face. "It's perfect," he said. "It's not a fight, it's a deposition." He made the call. He told Margaret that enough time had passed, and that we all needed to sit down together to talk things through and move forward as a family. He used her own corporate, HR-style language against her. The bait was irresistible. The idea of hosting a reconciliation dinner where she could once again play the role of the gracious, forgiving matriarch was something she could not refuse. She agreed immediately, her voice, according to Mark, practically purring with magnanimity. She would cook her famous roast chicken. It would be a chance for healing. The day of the dinner, I felt a strange sense of calm. I dressed simply in dark pants and a plain blouse. I wasn't dressing for a fight, I was dressing for a board meeting. I carried the 4 manila folders in my tote bag. They felt heavy, not with paper, but with the weight of consequence. As we drove to my in-laws' house, Mark reached over and took my hand. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. "Whatever happens, I'm with you." The dinner itself was a masterclass in tension. Margaret was in full hostess mode, bustling around the kitchen, talking about trivialities, the weather, a neighbor's new car, a sale at the department store. She was pointedly avoiding the elephant in the room, creating an atmosphere of forced normalcy. Arthur was quiet and stern, barely looking at his wife, his responses to her chatter clipped and monosyllabic. Jessica just picked at her food, her eyes darting between me and her mother. We ate the roast chicken and the overcooked vegetables in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware against china. Margaret kept trying to fill the silence with bright, empty questions, and we would all respond with one-word answers. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter and tighter around the dining room table. Finally, after we had finished the main course and Margaret stood to clear the plates, I spoke. "Before you do that," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the strained atmosphere, "there's something I'd like to discuss." Margaret paused, a plate in each hand, a look of cautious surprise on her face. "Of course, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "We're all here to talk." That was my cue. I reached into my bag, pulled out the 4 manila folders, and calmly placed one in front of each person at the table. The final family dinner was about to begin. The sound of the manila folders being placed on the polished wood of the dining table was soft, but in the thick silence, it felt like a gavel striking down. Margaret stared at the folder in front of her as if it were a venomous snake. Arthur and Jessica both looked from their folders to me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Mark simply sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, his face a grim mask of support. "What is this, Brenda?" Margaret asked, her voice losing some of its syrupy sweetness, replaced by a sharp, defensive edge. "I thought we were here to heal." "We're here to establish a factual record," I replied, my voice calm and even. I was no longer the grieving victim from the baby shower. I was an archivist presenting my findings. Before any kind of healing can happen, the truth of what occurred needs to be acknowledged. "Please open the folder." With a hesitant hand, Margaret opened the flap. Her eyes scanned the top page, the typed transcript of the text messages. I watched as a flicker of confusion crossed her face, which quickly morphed into a look of outright panic as she continued to read. She snatched the glossy photograph from behind the paper, her breath catching in a small, sharp gasp. She was looking at the undeniable, time-stamped proof of her lie. The digital ghost had materialized on her dining room table. Arthur opened his folder next. He read the document slowly and deliberately, his brow furrowed. When he got to the photograph of the screenshot, he let out a low, weary sigh and stared at his wife with an expression of profound disappointment. It was not anger. It was something far worse. It was the look of a man whose last shred of respect for his partner had just evaporated. Jessica read hers quickly, her eyes welling up with tears. She looked from the paper to her mother and just shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I don't understand," Margaret stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "It was just a text message from years ago. I forgot all about it. My memory isn't what it used to be." It was the exact defense Jessica had predicted she would use. The forgetfulness card, the plea of old age and a fallible mind, but I was ready for it. "Your defense for your actions at the baby shower was that you forgot that Mark had explicitly forbidden you from discussing our loss," I said, keeping my tone measured and professional. "You portrayed your actions as a well-intentioned mistake, a lapse in memory. This document proves that is not the case. This document is the receipt for the boundary you crossed." I let the word receipt hang in the air. It was a transactional term, cold and impersonal. I was framing her emotional violation in the language of a business dispute. "You received a direct, unambiguous instruction," I continued, gesturing to the folder. "You acknowledged it. 3 years later, you chose to violate that instruction in the most public and painful way possible. This wasn't forgetfulness, Margaret. This was a decision. You read the message, you understood it, and at the party, you chose to ignore it for your own reasons." Margaret's face hardened. The mask of the gentle, misunderstood matriarch was crumbling, revealing the cold, hard face of a narcissist who had been caught. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You bring this file into my home and accuse me? I was trying to honor you, to show people your strength." "There is no honor in exposing someone's trauma without their consent," Mark cut in, his voice like ice. "You used our pain as social currency. You wanted the attention, the sympathy. Brenda's feelings were collateral damage, and you lied about it. You lied to Jessica, you lied to Dad, and you just lied to us now." Arthur finally spoke. He slid his folder to the center of the table and folded his hands. He didn't look at me or Mark. His eyes were fixed solely on his wife of over 40 years. "Is it true, Margaret?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy with authority. "Did you tell Jessica you simply forgot?" Margaret faltered, looking at her husband. He was her staunchest ally, the silent partner in her social endeavors. But his face offered no support, no escape route. I was upset," she stammered. "Everyone was yelling at me. I might have said, 'Did you lie to your daughter about why you hurt your daughter-in-law?'" Arthur pressed, his voice unyielding. Margaret stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She had been perfectly outmaneuvered. Any answer she gave would be an admission of guilt. If she said yes, she was a liar. If she said no, Jessica would know she was lying. She was trapped in a cage of her own making, and the proof was sitting on the table. In that moment, her power over the family shattered. It wasn't a loud, explosive demolition, but a quiet, structural collapse. Her authority was built on a foundation of plausible deniability, of her word against ours, of emotional manipulation that was hard to pin down. But I had brought a document, a primary source. You can't argue with a receipt. The confrontation was over. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't cried. I had simply presented the evidence and allowed the truth to do its work. I looked at Margaret, whose face had crumpled into a mask of bitter resentment. She wasn't sorry for the pain she had caused. She was furious that she had been caught. I gathered my purse. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Mark and I will be leaving now." We stood up from the table, leaving the folders, the records of her betrayal, behind for them to contemplate. The receipt had been presented. The transaction was complete. The silence that followed our departure from that dinner was more profound than any argument could ever have been. We didn't get angry phone calls or tearful texts. There were no demands for an apology or accusations of cruelty. There was just nothing. The communication line to Margaret went completely dead. It was as if by presenting the undeniable truth, we had severed a cord, and the resulting silence was the sound of a connection that could not be repaired. In the weeks that followed, the new family dynamic began to solidify along the fault lines that Margaret's actions had exposed. Mark and I focused on ourselves. It felt like emerging from a long, low-grade fever I hadn't even realized I was suffering from. The constant, subtle stress of managing Margaret, of bracing for her next passive-aggressive comment or boundary-pushing question, was gone. Our home felt lighter, our conversations easier. We were no longer editing our lives for her consumption. We were just living. The wound from the baby shower was still there, but it was clean now. It was no longer infected with the poison of her manufactured narrative. I knew what had happened was a malicious act, not a misunderstanding, and having that truth validated was a powerful anesthetic for the pain. The first real sign of the permanent shift came from Arthur. About 2 weeks after the dinner, he called Mark. He didn't mention the confrontation directly. Instead, he asked if he could take us out for lunch, just the three of us. We met at a quiet diner, a neutral space. Arthur looked older, more tired, but also more at peace than I had ever seen him. He formally apologized to me. "Brenda," he said, looking me directly in the eye, "what Margaret did was inexcusable. There is no justification for it, and what you did at dinner, it was necessary. Sometimes, the only way to deal with a fiction is to present the facts." He explained that he and Margaret were in counseling, but he was not optimistic. He spoke of a long history of her managing perceptions, of her need to control every narrative, and how our incident had been the final, clarifying moment for him. "I enabled it for too long," he admitted, a deep sadness in his voice. "By staying silent, I cosigned her behavior. That's over now." He didn't promise she would change, but he promised that he would. He would no longer be a passive bystander. His relationship with her was his to navigate, but his relationship with us would now be on a foundation of his own making, based on respect for our boundaries. It was a monumental step. Jessica became our bridge. She would visit us on her own, bringing her new baby girl, Lily, for us to meet in the quiet comfort of our living room, away from the judgmental eyes of her mother. She told us that Margaret was putting on a brave face to her friends, spinning a vague story about a family disagreement, but that at home, she was either icily silent or prone to bitter outbursts about my betrayal. She refused to acknowledge her role in what had happened. She had cast herself as the victim of a cold, calculated coup orchestrated by her ungrateful daughter-in-law. It was a narrative that allowed her to avoid any semblance of self-reflection, but it was a narrative that now had no audience within her own family. No one was buying it. Jessica kept our relationship separate from her mother. "My relationship with you and Mark is important to me," she said one afternoon as I held Lily. "I won't let Mom's toxicity poison this." And she kept her word. We became closer than ever, bonded by a shared understanding of the woman who had tried to drive us apart. Months have passed now. We did not see Margaret at Thanksgiving. We did not see her at Christmas. The holidays were quiet, spent with Arthur and Jessica's little family. They were smaller, yes, but they were also peaceful. There was no walking on eggshells, no forced conversation, no underlying tension. It was just calm. Mark and I have started talking about trying for a family again. The idea, which once felt fraught with the terror of potential failure and the dread of Margaret's intrusive involvement, now feels like a hopeful possibility. Our future is our own again, to write on our own terms. I don't know if Margaret will ever change or if our relationship will ever be more than a cold, distant formality. I have accepted that it probably won't. I did not set out to destroy my mother-in-law. I set out to protect my truth. My revenge was not loud or fiery. It was quiet, methodical, and factual. It was the revenge of an archivist. I took a chaotic, painful event, organized the evidence, and presented a factual record that could not be denied. I didn't get a dramatic apology or a tearful confession. What I got was something far more valuable, a reckoning. A quiet, permanent redrawing of family lines, and a future free from the tyranny of a narrative that was never mine. I got peace. And in the end, that was the only justice I ever really wanted.